So, keeping on the Titanic theme, I want to talk a bit about the breakdown of the passengers and the survivors versus the victims in terms of class and so on, because this is something that is often, in my view, misinterpreted, or at least there's some myths out there. One of them is that all of the third class were held below deck and all of the rich survived. That's clearly not the case. But anyway, I want to break this down then. I want to talk about the wider issue of women and children. It's something that is often associated with the Titanic, but it's something that I think needs to be discussed a little bit in today's context. So this is the breakdown of passengers. And this is official. First class, there was a total of 325 passengers on board. Of that, there were 6 children, 144 women, 175 men. Of the children, 5 survived, and surprisingly, 1 actually perished. That child is quite famous. I forget their name now, but basically that is highly unusual, and the reason that child perished, by the way, no children in second class perished. The reason they think that happened was because whilst the children put on the lifeboats, they believe that one of the children was taken off again whilst there's basically the family was broken up. I forget the name of the family, which is a little bit frustrating, but anyway, just Google only first class child on the Titanic to die. It's an interesting backstory, and there was a whole legal case around that. Of first class women, 140 survived, 4 perished. One of them was Isa Strauss, who refused to part from her husband. There's a famous memorial to that couple in, I believe it's in Hyde Park in New York City. Of the men, and this is interesting, 118 first class men perished, 57 survived. So a clear majority of first class men perished. I think that puts to bed the myth that first class men were these elitist sort of snobs who were very selfish. Actually, what that shows is there were a lot of first class men who had in their concept a notion of honour. There were famous people like Jacob Astor and Benjamin Guggenheim. As we know, and I'll get more to this in a minute, men like Bruce Ismay, who did survive, were vilified. So a majority of first class men actually perished. There's a famous scene in the Cameron film where I think it's Guggenheim and his manservants say, "We've dressed as our best and we're prepared to go down as gentlemen." So no one could deny that some of those first class men acted with bravery. Second class, a total of 285 passengers, 24 children, 93 women and 168 men. And of that, 24 children survived, none perished. 80 second class women survived, 13 perished. Now, second class men is interesting because it was by far the proportion that suffered the greatest of all groups of people on board the Titanic. 92% of second class men perished, only 14 survived. 154 second class males on board the Titanic perished. That's 92%, so that's worth bearing in mind. Then we get on to third class, the steerage, which made up the bulk of passengers, and of course they were hit hard. Earlier on I mentioned it wasn't a case that they were kept down exactly, but that's not to say that they didn't have a disadvantage from being steerage passengers, because they absolutely did. But one misconception, and I think the films misinterpret this, is that there were gateways blocking the different classes, but that was for the regular voyage, and it was for immigration purposes in New York. I don't think there's any evidence that they were actually blocked from coming up. It is true that first class passengers got priority, which of course is shameful, but I don't think it's a case that they were held down in the decks with guns. I think that's slightly artistic license, because there's no evidence that that was the case. Of third class, there were 79 children, 165 women, 462 men. A lot of them were immigrants going to the New World. Of that, 27 children survived, some 52 children perished, third class. 76 women survived, 89 women perished. So that is the only group of women which had a percentage who actually perished. A lot of those were single women going to join their husbands, from what I understand, who were already labourers in the New World. Third class men, a very heavy blow, but actually the percentage wasn't as high as second class men. 75 survived, 387 perished, but the actual percentage terms is still less than second class. Now, that works out at a total of 498 passengers survived, and I'm just looking, I think it's 818 passengers perished. Out of the crew, there was no children. Although I'm not sure why that is the case, because there were bellboys who were only 12 years old. But basically, of women who considered part of the crew, that, for example, was stewardesses and so on, like the famous Violet Jessop, 20 survived, 3 perished. Of male crew, 192 survived, and a huge number, 693, perished. Many of them would have been stokers, firemen, who would have had no chance. They were among the very first to feel the impact. But that's basically the breakdown of the Titanic. In total, it was 1,514 perished. Some give a little bit higher, 1,517. 710 survived. So clearly, a majority of people on board the Titanic perished. Now, I was going to talk a little bit about the women and children first phenomenon. This goes back to a disaster in the 1860s on board HMS Birkenhead. I believe that was in the mouth of the River Mersey. And on board that ship there were soldiers and sailors, and although it wasn't actually a written code of the time, they implied that it should be women and children first. There were women on board that ship. So in that disaster, back in the 1860s, that actually gave fame to the saying women and children first. Now, in terms of what has changed since the days of the Titanic, the only thing that has really changed is safety. And that itself is only the case in developed countries. In many developing countries, safety is still abysmal. They have overcrowded ferries. All the time you hear about disasters in Bangladesh, in the Philippines, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There's overcrowded ferries all the time, and these disasters sadly happen far too often, and they barely make news. Unfortunately, I do think there is a bias insofar as first world versus developing world tragedies. In terms of the women and children first thing, this is something I want to talk a little bit about. Of course, it relates directly to the code of chivalry, but it is somewhat of a controversial thing, and a lot of men's rights activists would say this is really the epitome of the expendable male problem. Now, in my own opinion, it shouldn't be a case of one life versus another life. It should be a case that the safety standard should be such that everyone survives. Sometimes I do think the passenger liners are building these days are, whilst they're very impressive, they're almost too big. When you look at the Allure of the Seas and the Oasis of the Seas, which are the largest passenger ships sailing, they are the Titanic and the Olympic of 2014, and they're massive. In gross tonnage, they're something like 5 times heavier than the Titanic. They're absolutely massive, and they're magnificent, but it is a little bit concerning to think that if something happened to those ships in the North Atlantic, it's slightly alarming, or in the Caribbean. I mean, the Costa Concordia is the closest example we have, and it wasn't a case that everyone survived. 32 people perished. Let's not forget that. So, and that was in shallow water. The idea of women and children first. Now, in my own reckoning, I completely understand the children first concept, because they have the rest of their lives ahead of them. They're vulnerable people, that goes without saying. But you could make an analogy. Why should a healthy 30-year-old woman have precedence over, let's say, a disabled man who's also 30, or an elderly man who is less likely to survive cold conditions? A healthy young woman, let's say she goes to the gym every week, she's physically healthy, would probably have a better chance of surviving cold water than a frail 80-year-old man. What about men in wheelchairs? and so on. So I do think there's certain contentious issues with this. Now I have to say, I'm not opposed to the idea of chivalry necessarily. I know there's a lot of MRAs out there who are, although I'm not an MRA. Personally, if I was with my loved one, my girlfriend or a wife, or even close female friends, female family members, I would be wanting to make sure they were safe. So I do have a chivalrous concept, and that's just not saying that to be a white knight. It's genuinely how I feel. I would want to make sure my girlfriend was safe. I mean, that's not that I would want to die, I'd want to be safe as well. But if it came down to that sort of life and death choice, me or my girlfriend, I would choose her, I would. I am quite old-fashioned in that sense. And this isn't just restricted to maritime incidents. During the Aurora shooting a few years ago, the spree shooting, there were stories of boyfriends sacrificing their lives to protect their women. 9/11, of course, there was many heroics during 9/11, both male and female, I have to say. But throughout history there's been examples of brave men sacrificing their lives to protect women, and it's something that flies in the face of the feminist claim of male privilege, although I've made another video specifically about that. But I don't think it's a case that men should be expendable. I think it's a case that the safety standard should be such that everyone should be saved. In this day and age, there's no reason why people should be dying in maritime accidents. And when these disasters happen, it's usually because the ships are overcrowded, and there's very lax safety situations. And of course you have the terrible situation in the Mediterranean. Many victims are migrants from Africa. So there's a lot of contentious issues. You have situations, the Titanic is the most famous example, but it just seems a little bit bizarre in this day and age that someone like Bruce Ismay was basically vilified for the crime of surviving. And there's a lot of tosh, actually, that unfortunately every film adaptation has shown about Bruce Ismay. I think it is absolutely implausible he would have pushed past women and children in order to get onto a lifeboat. Actually, the report goes that he got onto a lifeboat because he was ordered to by an officer. Now, there's discrepancy in what actually happened on the Titanic between officers Murdoch and Lighthauler. They misinterpreted, or they interpreted the instructions their own way from Captain Smith. Murdoch took it to mean women and children first, whereas Lighthauler took it to mean women and children only. So, where there were a lot of male fatalities, it would have been on the Lighthauler side. Of course, there was many women died on the Titanic as well, but I don't think it's a case that men push past them, and I think that's grossly unfair. I think it's more a case of negligence, the fact there weren't enough lifeboats. And even if people got onto the lifeboats, there was other issues like hypothermia they conceivably could have died from. So, you know, people perish on the Titanic for a whole range of reasons, although definitely negligence was a big part of it. Ironically, the Titanic actually met the safety standards of the day, but as we know now, it was far too little. But this notion of women and children first, I mean, you see it all the time in the media. Even today, when there's a plane crash or a terrorist attack, you always hear the newsreaders saying women were among the victims, as if women's lives are more important than men. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not that I am desensitized to innocent women being killed, but why is it that an innocent, I mean, put it this way, if I know there's a whole argument about physical strength, but if you have something like a plane crash, you can have a tough guy who's a cage fighter or a bodybuilder. If he's in a plane crash, that isn't going to make any difference, he's still going to die. So there is definitely a problem with the expendable male idea, and it's something that feminists both ignore and perpetuate. Although I wouldn't blame feminists solely for that, because actually patriarchy is partly to blame, traditional patriarchy is partly to blame, and men need to understand, MRAs need to understand that patriarchy is just as much a threat to them as feminism is, in the sense that it was patriarchy, not feminism, that shamed men like Bruce Ismay, who, and also shamed men in the notorious White Feather campaign in World War I. Personally, I am old-fashioned in the sense that I would want to look after the women in my life, but in terms of a stranger, would I die for a woman who I don't know? I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. and I don't think I should. Maybe that sounds selfish, but I believe in this day and age equality should mean equality, and that means that all innocent human lives should be seen as one and the same. So the media has a part to play in this. They should stop with this idea that innocent men are somehow worth less than innocent women. It's ridiculous. So let me know your thoughts on this. I'm going to have to round it up now.